Welcome to this episode of Touchline Talk by Soccerspective. I'm your host, Brandon Faust, and joined with me, Ashwin Jadhav. Today, we're demystifying soccer positions, the numbers, the tactical responsibilities, and how roles have evolved over time. And before we get into it and we start talking specifically about the number 9 position, I think it'd just be good for us just to review. A lot of us might, not use the numbering system in our language. I would encourage you to think through that if you're coaching at some level. But Ashwin, talk us through the numbering system a little bit and what do those mean, or what maybe there's an original meaning to them and those have changed over time, or maybe there's certain numbers we don't use in 7v7 or 9v9 as focal points. But talk us through, we have the number 1 is the goalkeeper, and then talk us through kind of some of the other positions on that before we start really breaking it down here.
Yeah, I think the numbering system is a really unique way of describing the roles and responsibilities. And I think I want to stress on the word responsibilities here because, roles are relatively fluid from time to time, but your responsibility as a player really depends on whether you're a deep lying central midfielder or whether you need to be box to box or whether you need to attack a bit more, right? And these numbers completely change your responsibility as a player, right? So I think us as coaches, Brandon, we use these numbers quite a lot because it's much easier to explain to a player to play as a number 8 or a number 6 instead of describing what a central defensive midfielder needs to do in the game at a given time, right? Because you've kind of coached them already with that numbering system, and you've explained to them their responsibilities when they have the ball, when they don't have the ball, etc. So it becomes a lot easier as a coach to really understand your setup, right? And then you can kind of
Absolutely, because way back in the Stone Ages when I played, everyone's 4-4-2 and they're saying play right mid. Well, what is that now, right? Like, would that be a number 2? Would that be a number 7? It's somewhere in between, right? Between these outside attacking backs, wing backs, wingers, right? So it gives some better nomenclature than some terminology that might change if you change a team, change a coach, and different things like that. So if you're not using the numbering system, I would encourage you, and let this even be a reference. There's other, we have other resources on our Soccerspective YouTube channel, as well as other things you can find online to really embrace this and start teaching these ideas so that they understand the principles of what that number is to do and the responsibilities like you shared.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a simple example here is when you have, let's say, a right wing player, right? And you want that right wing player to be in a more attacking role when your team has the ball. You would explain to that player to say, I want you to be in a number 7 position when we have the ball. So go up the field, and I want you to be in a number 2 position when we don't have the ball. So you're going to be part of the defensive line, right? So all you have to explain to that player is when we have the ball, you're a number 7. When we don't have the ball, you're a number 2, right? So that really communicates the entire concept to that player instead of really going into a lot of detail in a tactical situation during the game, right? And you and I know how important time is, and communication has to be very swift, very, very, very fast with the player. So this really explains that quite a bit in a very simpler way, right?
Yeah, and really, we start at the back with the goalkeeper as the number 1, and I know a lot of times in formations we might omit that, right? We might say 4-4-2 or 4-3-3, and then you always start with the 1 at back there, and then on the right side, the right outside defensive player is the number 2. The left outside defensive player is the number 3. We have the 4 and the 5 as the center backs. A number 6 is that kind of holding midfield position, kind of shielding that back line, if you will. The number 7 then moves to the right side, kind of that right winger type position. And number 8 is that proper central midfield player, box to box type mid. A number 9 is your, striker up front, your forward. Number 10 is that attacking mid playmaker. And then your number 11 is that left winger. And we realize that, a lot of us are coaching, and we might not be coaching 11v11, right? We might be coaching a 4v4 setup, the 7v7, 9v9, or some iterations in between there. I know there's different, in the United States and Canada, there's some similarities in that here in North America. But, when you get into Europe, they're doing 5v5 instead of 7v7 at that age, right? So in all of this, I think it's really, really important to even start those ideas early and often. Because one of the teams I'm coaching right now, it's U7 girls, right? One of my kids is on that team, and it's 4v4. There's no goalkeepers. It's small, think kind of lacrosse or hockey size goals, right? And all we're trying to teach them at this age developmentally is we want them to be confident on the ball. We want them to understand how to use the bottom of their foot to manipulate the ball, to create space, to be brave, right? To get that confidence to go again, and then how to recover into some sort of defensive shape, right? We're not doing a bunch of tactics at this age or things like that. We're not trying to ping 17 passes together yet or anything like that. But we get into that basic diamond shape. And why we do that is it gives us 3 layers, okay? And it starts ingraining those principles. So we have a number 4 at the back, okay, one singular center back. We have a number 7 on the outside, a number 11 on the outside, and a number 9 up top. So this is now creating, in confined spaces where kids just want to chase the ball. We're trying to create in the attack. We're trying to create space, right? We're trying to create space so that their teammate can dribble, can create space to dribble the ball, shoot the ball, or pass the ball, right? We want to encourage those things, and so we got to give each other some space. But it also gives them a reference point, particularly on restarts, right? At this age, they're doing kick-ins, right? So it's a kick-in instead of a throw-in, goal kicks, corner kicks, kickoffs. It gives them a reference point of where might I be to be in space to help protect the goal, to help win the ball back, things like that. And so even at that, U5, U6, U7, you can start introducing these principles. And that's just one idea. I know some other people want to have, 2 number 6s and not play with a number 9 or something like that. But that diamond shape is something that continues through, especially in the paradigm in the United States soccer kind of orientation of principles of play. Their base level for principles of play, even though you can change formations, is a 4-3-3, right? And so this just kind of builds off of that trellis to have a defensive player, 2 wide players, an attacking player, and to create space, right? And have a reference point of where do I need to be in attack? What's my responsibility in defending? And to go from there. As we move into it, though, what have you seen, Ashwin, as we move kind of into that 7v7? What are some of the principles or numbers that you see getting used there? And I can share some of my experiences on that as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the 4v4 and the 5v5, because that becomes really your baseline, and you're really focusing on space and specific roles right there, because when you have the ball, you're trying to do different things, and when you don't, your shape is completely different, right? So kids are starting to really understand that at that age. And then when you go into the 7v7, they're specializing a bit more. So they start to get into, I'm a defender, I'm a midfielder, I'm an attacker, those concepts. And so that's when you really want to start introducing some of these numbering systems in there. So, on a basic level, when you're playing 7v7, I think my favorite is really to go with a 3-2-1 formation, right? Because that can ingrain some of the more basic elements of roles and responsibilities with the kids. So, for example, when you have a back 3, you essentially have a number 2 on the right, a number 3 on the left, and then a 4 or a 5 in the middle, right? So everybody's starting to understand those numbers and those roles and responsibilities, and then you can start to really develop that further, right? Because those three defenders, when you have the ball, one of them can push up into midfield if you'd like. So that number 2 effectively becomes a number 7 when you have the ball, right? So you start to explain these concepts, and then that 3-2-1 when you have the ball actually becomes more of a 2-3-1 or a 2-4-1 rather, right? So I think, all of these concepts start to evolve, and those roles and responsibilities start to really change quite a bit, right? Even your number 9 in the 7v7 should not always stay your number 9, right? Because you want to explain the concept of, when we don't have the ball, I want my number 9 to drop back and put pressure in the right way with my midfield, right? So many times in a 7v7, your number 9 is actually playing as a number 10 or number 8, effectively, and becoming part of that integrated midfield, and putting pressure on the ball when you don't have it, right? So I feel like the 3-1 has been a really good basic formation that I've been able to implement and then teach kids certain principles, and it's worked really well, right? But I know in different situations, you might want to switch that around a bit more as well, as your players evolve, as they understand other roles and they get at a more advanced level. Coaches should really try to tinker with that and play around with that. But you got to remember that the basic there is understanding those roles and responsibilities when you have 7 players on the pitch. Yeah, what have you seen in terms of formations in that 7v7 setup?
Yeah, I think the one that I'm currently using, so I'm coaching 2 teams at 7v7 right now, and we use that 3-2-1. And what we like to do is, we have a number 4, number 2, number 3, and exactly what you instructed. In attack, our 2 and our 3 are functioning as functional wingers in our attack, right? We want to get the ball wide, right, to those players, let them have space, create. There's a lot of running for that position. But then what we like to do with the 2 midfielders is we have a 6 and an 8, because now we've introduced, right, in the attack, we have multiple layers, right? We're introducing the principle of having those different kind of segments of the pitch, right? We've got a number 4, we got a 2 and a 3 that sit a little higher, maybe in line with that number 6. So we've got another shelf there. We've got another shelf of the number 8, and then another shelf of the 9. And to your point, that number 9 does function. The instruction is that's your first line of defense, right? And so that sometimes drops down into like what a functional 10 or 8 would look like on a pitch. And what we really like about that is it starts stimulating the ideas for our midfielders of how do we win the ball, and then how can we move the ball effectively, while also creating opportunities that sometimes that means you're going to play, an invite pass behind you. You're going to drop the ball back. We're going to cycle it through our number 4 or even through our number 1, as you get some of these teams that are a little bit more, technically advanced and tactically advanced as well. And so a lot of the different things that you're getting the instruction, since you're not playing with a 7 and 11, you're getting the function and the instruction in the attack of what a 7 and 11 will do in the future, while also teaching the 2 and the 3. So we really are teaching at that level principally almost everything, right? You don't have a functional 10, but like we said, we're kind of defending, or the 9 might sit back as a playmaker a little bit more, depending on how we're playing. So we're really starting to educate them on all areas of the pitch. And then we're doing a lot of rotation at this level, right? We're not just trying to win games at this level. Of course, we want to win and put our best foot forward, but it really is about developing these kids holistically, putting them in those environments, developing them to gain confidence, and helping them to discover and learn these different positions. And we always like to have, there's kind of 2 thoughts: as a position further back on the pitch and a position further forward on the pitch. Or I know some coaches who say you're going to have a wide role and an inside role. And we're going to rotate you between those, which can get challenging when you're only playing with 2 wide players. How do you keep that cycling? But so I think those then start setting up the structure to move to 9v9. Another one that I've seen where if you don't have in the 7v7, if you don't have quite as athletic of kids or conditioned kids to really run those two or three, or maybe you only have 8 players on the team, and so fatigue sets in, is that they'll play essentially like 2 center backs. They'll play 2 center backs, and then they might play even 2 number 9s. I don't like that because it then just kind of can get into like win the ball at the back and boom it up to your number 9. And it's just not the most pleasant soccer. I don't think it's the most developmentally helpful. But I have seen teams play with, maybe an iteration of two center backs, 2 number 9s up top, and then a couple of players across the middle as well. So I don't like it as much because you don't get that full education if you play like when you play in that 3-2-1, which I think is the most beneficial and structurally going to set you up to learn all those positions and move to 9v9. In 9v9, what we start to see is you can start taking this principle, and there's a couple ways you could interpret it. I've seen it interpreted like a 3-2-3. Right. So you have, okay, again, you're playing with that same back line, number 4, number 2, and number 3. Now, because there's more players on the pitch, your number 2s and 3s are going to function in a more defensive responsibility way. Maybe one of them gets into the attack. Then you have your 6 and your 8. And then you would have, your number 9, your number 7, and number 11. I know sometimes people like to list those in their front 3. Sometimes functionally people like to list them in their midfield, whichever you prefer is fine. But that 3-2-3 is something that our teams that are more technically advanced and physically capable of pulling it off, that's what we like to move them into. And again, we're now teaching all of those principles, again, of what you're going to move to in 11v11. You have a center back, you have an outside back, so you have a number 6, you have a number 8. You have wingers, you have a number, focal point of attack in your number 9. And the only thing that you're not getting is that, number 10 type role. But again, you'll see you can have your number 8 or your, number 9 kind of facilitate in that sort of role. What have you seen on your side that seems to be effective in that, at building that bridge as you go from that 7v7 to 9v9?
In the 9v9, I think you start to get some more advanced concepts discussed, right? Because you have a bit more space, you have a bit more width and depth. So this is where you want to start making concepts available to the kids, like diagonal runs, right? And when you have those diagonal runs being made, oftentimes positions get interchanged. So the player roles and responsibilities have to be a little more fluid versus the 7v7, because in the 7v7 you're a little more static from time to time, right? Your number 8s and your number 9s are going to stay fairly central. But in a 9v9 you start to have diagonal runs, right? And overlapping runs, underlapping runs. These are the concepts you really want to start to focus on a bit more in a 9v9. So I really like your idea of a 3-2-3 with an advanced setup. I've seen coaches just focus on simplicity sometimes, especially when they don't have the ball. They just love to have 2 banks of 4, right? So you have your 4 midfielders effectively and your 4 defenders, and you're coaching them the pressure, cover, balance concepts, right? So when the opponents have the ball in their back line, for example, your 4 midfielders step up, and the midfielder that's closest to the ball is applying the pressure and everybody else is covering, right? And when you're attacking, that formation changes slightly into a more fluid one, right? And this is where you want to really have a number 9, but then you want to encourage that number 9 to make diagonal runs, go to the wing sometimes, and you want your wingers to also underlap and overlap those runs as well. So yeah, I think it's really, as a coach, the 9v9 is a time when you need to understand the evolution from the 7v7 to the 11v11, right? And you gotta adapt that 9v9 to that transition, because I think most of us don't stay in the 9v9 for too long. It's a year, maybe 2 years at the max, right? Because it's a transitional year. So you want to focus on more of the concepts that will really help the kids with the 11v11 And I think, these diagonal runs become really important. How you cover width and depth becomes really important as well, because as you go to 11v11, your width and depth is going to change, right? Because suddenly you have a lot more space and just two more players to cover that space. So you really want to ensure the compactness and the defensive principles are really, really strong in the 9v9, because that forms the foundational elements for the 11v11, right? So I think, especially in my experience with the 9v9 setup, the number 6 and the number 8 roles are just so crucial, because you want them to cover the right amount of space at the right amount of time, because those two positions become your pivot points from attack to defense and vice versa, right? So I feel like those are the years, and that's the right setup to coach those number 6 and number 8 positions very, very effectively. And if you look at some of the great players, over time, right, they've really mastered those number 6 and number 8 positions really, really at a young age, right? And the number 6 oftentimes gets interchanged with like a number 4, number 5 as well, because the defensive principles are being developed in that 9v9 age.
Well, I think what's interesting about it too, I heard one of our directors of coaching at the club I'm at was talking about, 7v7, you're really instructing a lot of like two-player combinations, right? The give and goes, things like that. You start dipping your toe into three-player combinations, and then when you move to 9v9, it's like you're always thinking three-player combinations. It's more, the environment's more conducive to that. There's a lot more space. I think, a lot of attention goes from that, 9v9 to 11v11 field getting bigger, but that 7v7 to 9v9 jump is massive. The aerial ball starts playing a role, although in the United States, you can't head the ball until you're 12. That's usually about the time you're to do that. But that ball, that flighted ball is really involved now. There's a lot more space. There's more room to hit a ball outside the box or hit a diagonal ball across the field, because there's a lot of room and real estate. And so I think the encouraging, not just who can kick the ball the furthest, but like good play, right? And good play in an engine room of a 6 and an 8 really can transform, and preparing that in that 7v7 to that 9v9 jump is a really big deal, to be able to keep the ball on the ground. Who can control the ball? That ball's bouncing around, and it is challenging when you're at that age, when you're 10, 11, and the ball is bouncing around a lot. You can't use your head to bring it down, right? You can't. And so who can bring it to the floor? Who can control it? Who can be technical? And then play from there, I think, is a really, really important part of that game. But it's a reminder of the thread that you start pulling from 4v4 to 7v7 to 9v9, and then moving into that number 11, or 11v11. When you start moving into that bigger field, full size field, you start integrating now. You may have different formations, but the principles that you're going to play with, regardless if you're playing a 3-5-2, 4-3-3, a 4-1-4-1, whatever it is, the principles are contained in that, the knowledge of those numbers that those kids are comfortable with. They've seen it. So when you describe attack as a 7 and defend as a 2, they totally understand what you mean. Or attack like a 9 but defend like an 8. Okay, so now I'm a number 10, right? Those kinds of ideas, I think, are really, really critical. One of the positions that we want to spotlight in all of this is the number 9. And there is a resurgence of the number 9 position, right? The out and out striker. A lot of times in these setups, especially in the 4v4, 7v7, 9v9, a lot of times you're just going to have one. But even as we move into, I would say when we started moving into the 2010s, we started to see the 4-2-3-1, right? The lone striker. We had this evolution in the 90s where there was two, at the professional level and all the way down to the youth levels, the collegiate level. everyone was playing like a standard 4-4-2. You had two number nines, right? They would run off of each other. They would stay about 10 to 15 yards apart in tandem. You might have one stagger behind as more of a target striker. But there was two number nines leading the line. You think of in the 90s, you think of maybe Alan Shearer and Chris Sutton. You think in Italy of Vieri and Inzaghi. You think of Andy Cole and Dwight York at Manchester United. You maybe think of that small era of Raul and Ronaldo at Real Madrid, right? Brazilian Ronaldo. And so in the 2000s and in 2010s, there was this rise of the false nine. And what was interesting as I started diving into this is the false nine was introduced in the 1930s. And there was a Hungarian team, the Hungarian team of the era known as the Mighty Magyars. I might be not saying that quite correctly. They used a deep lying center forward or a false nine that disrupted the traditional tactics and formations of their opponents. People didn't know what to do with this. And it led to a huge rise of their success during that time. And now this didn't become a permanent tactic. This did not really, the principles didn't really spread at the time. But in the 1950s, there was a Hungarian player called Nandor Hidegkuti, who was renowned for his ability to draw defenders out of position by dropping into midfield. So the center backs would chase him, and it created space for him or his teammates to exploit. He was the kind of like godfather of the false nine. And now we've seen various iterations of the false nine arrive in like the 2010s and into the modern day, right? We saw Barcelona with Messi, how they would use him as a fluid false nine, and he would maybe move on the left side and roam over to the middle and roam over to the right side, or be the focal point of the attack. So you have that kind of fluid false nine. Then you have the deep lying false nine. The false nine drops even deeper into the midfield, sometimes even behind the number 10. We sometimes would see somebody like a Thomas Müller do this for Bayern or for when he played for Germany. And then you have the target man false nine, right? Where they drop deeper as a single number nine. They drop deep into target play, back to goal, and then distribute off of them. We even seen at times a player like Lukaku embrace that kind of role. Obviously, he can still lead the line and score goals, but to really have wingers run off of him and use his physicality. So the true number nine, though, has started to have a resurgence. We still had players in that era like a Zlatan Ibrahimovic who would still play that out and out number nine. But now we've seen, Robert Lewandowski. We're seeing Erling Haaland. We're seeing Alexander Isak. Players like what now Isak is interesting because he can also drift to the left side a little bit and things like that. But this resurgence of like the big out and out striker is kind of back. But at the youth levels, it's not necessarily always the biggest kid. Sometimes it's the fastest, one of the faster kids, or a kid who can just strike the ball well. But those principles of being, leading the line, the first application of pressure, staying high, being a goal scoring threat, getting in the box, those kinds of things. What are you seeing as even this season in a lot of the big leagues in Europe have kicked off? What are you seeing about the resurgence of the number nine, the value of a number nine for some of these big clubs?
Yeah, I think the value of the number nine is just tremendous, right? And it's primarily because of some of the things that you mentioned. Gone are the days where you had a 4-4-2 and you had two strikers who were playing off of each other, right? And a great example of this is Ruud van Nistelrooy, right? Out and out number nine. And when Sir Alex really got him to the club, he wanted him to play with Wayne Rooney. And Wayne Rooney really, really, from a coaching perspective, a gem of a player because he can play in so many different positions. I'm sure, Brandon, you've seen Wayne Rooney play in a number 9 role, in a number 8 role. Sometimes he's even played a number 10 role, right? And so he's really adaptive there. But I think his true strength became that number 10 role as his career developed, because he ended up playing not just as a second striker, but he used to drop back into midfield quite a bit. He was a creative engine, etc. So, as these formations have evolved with only one striker, such as the 4-2-3-1, that out and out striker, the emphasis on the qualities that that player has to bring is just huge, right? Because if you're not an out and out striker, and you really have to drop into midfield or go wide, then you're missing opportunities in the box, and you're missing that outlet that sometimes the players need to just drop the ball long, right? And you can see Erling Haaland do this a lot. He barely drifts deep. He'll barely go wide as well, and so he's a really out and out number nine. And it's great to see the game, really going down that direction, and that'll inspire future generations to really focus on being a true number nine. And another great example of this is a lot of the Man City goals, I think last season and the season before that as well, have come from Ederson playing a long ball to Erling Haaland, and Erling Haaland just running onto it and scoring, right? Or some other City player doing the exact same thing when Erling Haaland drops a little bit, right? So it's a great example of what you mentioned, where Erling Haaland draws that defender slightly deeper towards midfield, and one of the other wingers that Man City has makes a diagonal run to the center. Ederson gives a long ball, etc. So I think you have to be a true number nine to understand these concepts, and to then really build off of it, right? And I'm really excited to see other teams now focus on these roles quite a bit. You see Everton do this with Beto. Beto's been an out and out number nine for them. He's strong. He understands how to play off of his teammates, and he holds the ball better than anyone I've ever seen hold the ball up front. Right? You can play a long ball to Beto, and there'll be two defenders around him, and he'll hold the ball and delay so that the team can catch up and move forward. Right? And he's done that really well for Everton. It's partly the reason for the success they had last season, and I'm looking forward to seeing it this year as well. Another great example that has worked really well is Jean-Philippe Mateta for Crystal Palace, right? And I would say that it's him, and it's Eza, and the core team that they had built last season that was responsible for the silverware that they won, right, with the FA Cup. So I think it was, Mateta has stayed with Crystal Palace, and I'm looking forward to seeing what he brings in Europe this year, and with the league as well. But it's just great to see so many other teams that are mid table, and to the lower end of the table as well, in the EPL, really focusing on that number nine role, and it's creating some really exciting players. It's encouraging other players that there is a future as an out and out number nine, right? Because the trend that we were seeing over the past 5 to 10 years is that number nine is disappearing almost, right, with the false nine and all these
Hmm.
other concepts, right? And I think it's important to understand as well that the false nine concept in many cases was a tactical adjustment. It wasn't for any other reason, because Spain, as well, in the late 2000s, early 2010s, they had tremendous success with the false nine. The reason they had that success was because of the qualities of the players they had, and you could not leave any of those players out of the starting 11. And if you want those 11 players to play together, you have to sort of have those deep lying runs made by midfielders, right? And I
Hmm.
remember, Fabregas playing as a false nine at one point, which is weird to even think about, right? But they understood that they're the ones playing against you with each other, and they have to make those runs behind the defenders, and ensure that there's an outlet up top, right? So I think, yeah, it's great to see specific players now taking that mantle, and then moving the game forward. And yeah, you mentioned Alexander Isak as well. I'm really looking forward to seeing how he does with Liverpool. I do feel with Victor Gyökeres and with some of the other newer recruits to the English Premier League. I think they might need some time, right? Because
Yeah.
it's a different league. You have to adapt physically. The intensity is different as well. I would put Benjamin Sesko in the same kind of bucket, right? They need time, right? But Isak is proven. He's done this before. Liverpool already play free flowing football, right? And so really looking forward to how he does and what he brings as that number 9.
Yeah, I think it is going to be interesting to see, because what happens, whether we like it or not, is youth soccer starts to mirror what's happening professionally. And so the 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 success that was happening with Spain, Barcelona, teams like that, it was like the number 9 disappeared. There was, you didn't need that big body in there. You didn't need that aerial threat because the most talented players were midfielders, wingers. And it was kind of like we saw this in like professional basketball. Everyone became a 3 or a 4 in basketball, like a wing. They're 6'8". There's no centers anymore. Everyone can handle the ball, things like that was kind of happening in the evolution of, I think, development of athletics and recovery and training and nutrition. It was like these are the players that seem to have more success in this profile. And so then everybody became a winger, right? And then you kind of saw this whiplash happen over the next 5-10 years in youth soccer as well, to say, okay, now we're no longer playing 4-4-2 soccer. We are now playing a 4-2-3-1, a 4-3-3. We're training you for that because if you go and play in college or professionally or whatever, that's kind of the path you need to pick up. And you saw kind of a disappearance. There was always like a time at every level of soccer where there would be a number 9 who was just a big target and was probably the least technical player on the team, but just had a knack for goal, could finish. And it was almost like there was no longer a role for that kind of, player or body type or whatever it might be. So to see that come back, I think is really healthy for the game. I think there's also this, in the name of development, you know, I'm a huge proponent of development and actually having, youth not specialize in a position until they're probably 13, 14 years old, really anchoring them into a position or two positions at that age. But I think there's like this, oh, okay, they can score goals at this level, but they're really technical, so we're going to move them back to be a number 6 or number 8. I think there is something to be said, even at a young age of young kids and watching their developmental arc that just have a knack for goal. And I think, that I know it's not everything at the youth level, but it does become everything at the professional level and the collegiate level and the high level club soccer when you move into, 16, 17, 18 years old. The goals are few and far between and they're hard to find. And if you have someone who can be clinical with their chance in the box, you got to find a way to get them on the field. They might not be the fastest. They might not have the, be able to juggle the most on your team or have the most, technical ability. And that's often the case for good number 9s but they just find a way to be in good position. They know how to create space for themselves and for their teammates off the ball. And I think that's an underrated thing of these number 9s. You talked about Beto, kind of drawing defenders, playing with his back to goal and letting Grealish and Dewsbury Hall now, play off of him. And they've had some early success in the season doing that. But I think there's also those runs off the ball, those runs where they're creating space for their teammates. They're clearing out defenders. There is that intellectual side that I see coming back and with these number 9s as well, which is, I think it's good for the game. I think it's good top to bottom so that not everybody's like training just as a winger, that they can then move to play a number 2 or whatever. It's like, no, let's get those players who are clinical finishers, players who are really technical, really good on the ball, really tactically astute. Let's have a space for all of those kind of profiles of players and let them thrive and develop and do all of these things. Because I think a lot of times, there was an era of players where they would play with 2 strikers, right? And to be honest, when you play from age 12 to 19 or whatever, 18, whatever, if all you play is a number 9, you're probably missing out on a lot of development. You're missing out on a lot of opportunities on the ball. You're just finishing, things like that. then you show up, and I watch college players do this all the time. They're a number 9 on their team. They're a good player. They get recruited to play somewhere, or they get into some sort of academy. Well, now they don't know how to tackle. They don't know how to defend. They don't know how to position themselves as a 6 or an 8, and because all they've done is scored goals, right? So we want to make sure that we're developing, how do you, that tension of developing soccer players but also developing goal scorers, right? I think that is very, very real in this whole thing. So it'll be interesting to see the era. It'll be interesting to see this, in the next decade, what's happening with development, what's trickling down from the top level down. But I do like the resurgence of this number 9, and I think it's creating a space for more players, different player profiles to belong into the game and at the highest level. Who are a couple of young strikers that you're watching
Yeah,
out for,
absolutely.
our number
And it's going to
nines
be
in this
great to see
2025
how this
season?
evolves, right? Um,
We've mentioned some of the names, but yeah, what are some of those young ones that you're excited about?
in terms of young youth, right, I think there's just so much happening these days with youth, and you see the market is quite vibrant in general, right? So if you're a youth player in a club, you have a lot more opportunity than previous years, because you can go out on loan to prove yourself. You can get experience with the academy and then the younger teams, and you can also sort of break into the first team, right? So there's I don't think I have really specific names here, but the Liverpool academy is looking really good, and you can see the investment that the coaching staff has made there, similar to what they did at Feyenoord, right? They just focused on a lot of youth. You can see the development happening there, with Rio and Guma and Bendok now recently moved as well. So those players have come from the academy. I would also say there's really underrated academies out there in general that are producing great young players. I would say, academies like Southampton, for example, really they've produced some of the best players that we've seen, right? And I remember, back in the day, Theo Walcott is a really good example of, a player that really started off as a number 9 but then really evolved, right? And for Arsenal he started to play in that number 7 type role, and he knew exactly when he was a 9 and when he was a 7, and when to make those diagonal runs and all of that. And credit to Arsene Wenger for that. He really developed Theo Walcott at the highest level. So yeah, Southampton has always had a great academy, lots of young players coming through that system as well. And yeah, I think you have to start investing a lot more in youth these days. I see Chelsea doing that quite a bit now. They, and again, not given enough credit, but Pochettino actually brought up a lot of youth players during his tenure at Chelsea, and a lot of the players got chances because of him, right? And then even after he left, those players kept improving, and they started to perform, right? You can look up the exact squad list that he had when he was there, and I remember there were like 4 or 5 call-ups from the academy at that time. So really, really great to see coaches doing that quite a bit more these days. And I think, Brandon, you and I are coaches, and we have to look at youth as the primary outlet, not the transfer market, right? Otherwise, you kind of lose the essence of the club to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
And as coaches, when you start with coaching youth and you move your way up from there, you see that evolution, you see the potential being evolved more and more. So when you start to look at an 18-year-old who's an out and out number 9, you want him to break through to the first team, and so you'll try to do everything possible to ensure that number 9 develops and continues to improve his game, so that he can kind of one day take the mantle of the out and out number 9 for the senior team, right? So yeah, I'm seeing a lot of teams really do this in general, and really credit to all the coaches. And even if coaches are there for a very limited period, I see lots of different imprints of these things happening out there.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting. We're seeing in this era of the embracing of the number 9 role again, where you don't have to be the most. Look at the resurgence of Chris Wood. He's 30, 33, 34 years old for Nottingham Forest. And I mean, I saw this meme that's going around that he's like, I don't know, 12 or 14 goals away from tying Drogba's Premier League, tally, which is like baffling, right? Like that's crazy math in my head. But you have still Harry Kane, who's getting up there in age. Griezmann, who's getting up there in age. You have players, obviously Cristiano Ronaldo, right, who's getting up there in age that are still performing at a high level, because that number 9 is a position where you can embrace certain qualities and not others. But then you have players breaking through, like we've watched João Pedro very quickly slot in at Chelsea. Liam Delap, who was also signed just recently, unfortunately, with an injury here. You have players, highly touted players like Endrick for Real Madrid. You have Benjamin Sesko's like still only 22. A lot of pressure coming to Manchester United, right? They're going to want him to be able to produce now. Same with Gyökeres with Arsenal. Um, but but I think it's going to be interesting to see these young number 9s, like you said about Theo Walcott. Like, where do they end up? Cristiano Ronaldo was he was a right mid when he broke through at Manchester United, and then eventually towards his last couple of years there, they started playing him a little bit more in that advanced role. And then obviously, at Real Madrid had a lot of his success, in that more out and out number 9 type role. So it's going to be interesting to see which of these young players kind of breaks through, how do you get the consistency? And then, where do they settle in? Because you watch players, that's the pressure of a number 9. If you're not producing, you can do a lot of things right. But like, I know injuries are the case, but like, look at Gabriel Jesus from Arsenal. Like, where's he? I know he's had injuries and things, but like players like that. And I know with when he was at Manchester City, it seemed like they weren't quite. He was kind of a utility. You can play him on the wing if you need to. You can play him as like a complementary number 9, but like if he's your out and out number 9, how is that going to work? Right. Just so it's going to be interesting to see how some of these young guys get their footing, where they end up in terms of where they end up on the pitch. Obviously you still have Erling Haaland's only 24, right? So he's still, Mbappe is, now 26 and the main man over at Real Madrid, right? So watching them continue, and he's kind of morphed into sometimes early in his career playing more on the outside and then moving into that focal number 9 type role. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens there. Who's going to stand out as a goal scorer this year? Let's go Premier League. Who's going to stand out as maybe one of those top goal scorers? In years previous, at times, right? It goes Mo Salah, Sonny. Over at Tottenham has now made his move to LAFC. Players who weren't necessarily out and out number 9s that are getting the goal tallies. Obviously, Erling Haaland's been in there, but what are one or two names that are surfacing for you in the Premier League? Who do you think is going to get their footing this season and push for that golden boot?
I have to go with Liverpool on this one, and I think just the number 9s that they have, both of them are probably gonna just be at the top of this list here, right? Hugo Ekitike and Alexander Isak. Mo Salah will also feature. I think he's gonna get a lot of goals this year, but again, we can't call him a number 9, right? So I would say Ekitike and Isak are ones to be looked out for. I still feel like Gyökeres and Sesko, they'll need time, right? So it'll be important to see it from a coaching perspective on how they improve, how they evolve, how they keep up with the intensity of the game. And yeah, I think next season they'll have a bigger impact and score a lot more goals. And yeah, in general, I'm also looking at João Pedro, right? He's had a great preseason. He's gelled in really well. And Chelsea are really doing well in general, right? So he'll be one to look out for as well. So yeah, these are the teams I think I would say that will be fun to watch. I mentioned Everton and Crystal Palace, right? And Beto and Mateta respectively. So they're going to be right up there for me, because they get a decent number of goals in the season. They take penalties from time to time. So yeah, there's a lot of potential there to really be someone on the watch list, right? Yeah. Other than that, I'm not sure how the other smaller teams would perform this year, but yeah, these are the ones for me in the EPL to watch out for.
Yeah. I think the what's interesting is Brian Mbeumo, who's now at Manchester United. He had 20 goals last year in the Premier League, which is insane. And Cunha had 15 for Wolves. Neither of them are like the proper out and out number 9, so it's kind of an interesting tension there. And the same with Wisa, who's going to Newcastle. Kind of not necessarily that out and out number 9. It'll be interesting to see what Ollie Watkins can do with Villa. And I know, they're kind of feels a little bit, they had some activity at the end of the window, but and then what can Chris Wood do again, right? In his mid 30s, right? Last year had 20 goals, which is just unheard of. But I think the other one is Strand Larson from Wolves, had 14 goals last year that I could see. I think they're in for a scrap this year, probably towards the bottom of the table. But if they're going to stay up, it's going to come on, someone like his is back. And you even still see Raul Jimenez, for Fulham. And I know that Muniz is kind of pushing him a little bit, and they're starting to rotate who starts what. But those are two guys that are like proper number 9s, still. So it'll be interesting. I agree. I think Erling Haaland will find himself, at the top of that list. The only other number 9s that I think could compete are maybe some combination of Ekitike and Isak's numbers, combined, because Salah's going to get his goals. Gakpo is going to get some goals. We're gonna see they're gonna have to spread the wealth a little bit, but maybe if someone like Ollie Watkins can stick his neck out there and take that next step and get into that kind of 20 goal territory this season. So. Well, that's all we have for you this time on this episode of Touchline Talk by Soccerspective, as we helped try to demystify the numbering system of some of those soccer positions. We spent a little bit of time talking about the implications of that from the professional level all the way down to the grassroots level, and the evolution of the number 9 role and the resurgence of proper number 9. So it's going to be fun to pay attention. It's going to be fun to see that both at the youth levels as that resurges over the next couple years, but also what's going to happen in these top leagues around the world. Ashwin, thanks for joining us again this week, and we'll see you next time on Touchline Talk by Soccerspective.